The dog suddenly snatched the baby violently, sensing a threat nobody else could see, dragging him out of the crib in terror. The parents woke, hearing horrifying sounds echoing, their hearts pounding wildly as they sprinted barefoot through the dark house, consumed by fear. Smoke filled the hallway thick and fast, blinding them completely, as the temperature inside the house began rising like hell's breath. Outside, the dog stood trembling, holding the baby gently while staring directly at the burning house like confronting something unspeakable inside. But as flames roared behind him, something far more terrifying than fire moved within the shadows, revealing a horror unthinkable. They realized too late, the fire wasn't the real danger. What lived beneath their home was waiting to emerge. Nicholas, barely breathing, couldn't yet know that he had been chosen long before his parents ever bought this cursed home. John, hearing Rex's growls, had no idea that his child was the final piece in a ritual seeking completion. Rex, growling low, certainly had no idea that his final battle would rewrite the town's buried history forever. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. It warms my heart to see how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy heartfelt tales like this one, don't forget to subscribe. There's more to come. Now, let's begin. It all started with the kind of peaceful, ordinary evening that folks in small towns come to cherish deep in their bones. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving behind streaks of amber and violet that slowly faded into a blanket of dark velvet sky. In the modest town of Elmridge, the kind of town where neighbors still knew each other's names, and folks left their doors unlocked without much worry, the Bennett family settled quietly into the gentle rhythm of nightfall. John Bennett, a man whose hands carried the memory of 30 years at the steel plant, locked up the house with the same care he applied to every tool he had ever handled. His wife, Laura, soft-spoken yet steady as a lighthouse beam, moved through the nursery, humming a lullaby passed down from her own mother, as she tucked their 10-month-old son, Nicholas, into his crib beneath a sky-blue blanket embroidered with tiny stars. The house breathed quietly, the old wooden floors creaking softly under the weight of the day's quiet labor, as the wind outside rustled through the elm trees that had given the town its name so long ago. And lying there by the warm glow of the fireplace, resting his head on his massive paws, was Rex, their loyal German shepherd, who had watched over this family with unwavering devotion since long before Nicholas had come into their lives. Rex's eyes, dark and wise, followed Laura as she gently dimmed the lamp and whispered goodnight to her son, the soft rise and fall of the baby's chest filling the room with a rhythm older than time itself. The house settled into stillness as John returned to the bedroom, unfastening his wristwatch and placing it on the worn oak nightstand, its familiar ticking filling the silence like the steady beat of a quiet old song. Outside, the wind whispered through the branches, carrying with it the smells of earth and rain, while overhead the moon stood guard, casting its pale watchful eye across the rooftops of Elmridge. Rex's ears twitched occasionally, alert to every creak, every distant rustle, every sound that didn't quite belong, but for now, the old shepherd found nothing to disturb his watch. Yet beneath that calm surface, as the minutes passed into hours and the clock's hands crept toward the early morning, something subtle shifted, something faint, nearly imperceptible, like a thread beginning to unravel from a well-woven cloth. At precisely 3 a.m., the old grandfather clock in the hallway struck, each chime rolling through the house like echoes through a canyon, marking the silent transition from night into the deeper hours before dawn. And it was then, under the cover of that heavy, pre-dawn stillness, that Rex's head lifted slowly from his paws, his nostrils flaring as they caught something foreign, something that didn't belong. He rose with deliberate care, his powerful frame moving across the wooden floor with a grace that belied his size, every muscle responding to an instinct that ran deeper than reason. The shepherd stood still for a moment, ears pointed forward, tail low but tense, as the scent grew stronger, not strong enough to alarm a human, but undeniable to him. The baby monitor crackled faintly on the nightstand in the Bennett's bedroom, but no cries came through, only the gentle hum of static mixed with the soft breaths of their sleeping child. Yet for Rex, it wasn't the sound that stirred him, it was the air itself, charged with something unseen, something ancient in its warning. He took a step toward the nursery, his nails clicking softly against the hardwood, his eyes narrowing as the scent thickened, as if the walls themselves whispered to him of a danger just beyond comprehension. Outside, a distant owl called into the night, but inside that house, the world had shifted in a way none of the Bennetts yet understood. And as Rex stood before the closed door to Nicholas's room, staring at it with the unwavering focus of a soldier on post, he let out a low, barely audible whine, not of fear, but of urgent concern. In their bedroom, Laura stirred once more, her eyes blinking open as she listened to the soft noise. She reached across the bed, her fingers gently shaking John's shoulder. "John, did you hear that? Did you hear what Rex just did?" she whispered, her voice fragile, like a bird's wing in the dark. John's eyes opened slowly, the weight of sleep still pulling at his senses, as he processed his wife's urgent whisper in the dim room. "I heard him, Laura." His voice was low, steady, in touch with that familiar grit that life often gives to men who've worked with their hands. He sat up fully now, feeling the cool air of the room settle across his skin like an old, familiar blanket, while his mind began to sharpen against the growing tension. Reaching instinctively for the pair of worn slippers beside the bed, John glanced toward the faint green glow of the baby monitor, its soft hum barely masking Rex's distant whine. The monitor crackled again, but this time there was something underneath, not the baby's cry, but a faint rustling sound that seemed out of place in the nursery. John's brow furrowed as he rose from the bed, carefully pulling his robe closed around him, his heart beginning to stir with a sense of unease that he couldn't quite name. "There's no reason for Rex to be in Nicholas's room this late," John murmured, more to himself than to Laura, though she clung to his every word. Laura sat up straighter, her hands tightening around the edge of the blanket, as her voice trembled just enough to betray the worry blooming inside her chest. "What if something's wrong, John? What if he senses something we can't see?" she asked, her voice almost breaking under the weight of the unknown. John paused at the doorway of their bedroom, his hand resting on the cool brass handle, as he turned to offer her the calm reassurance she needed. "Rex has always protected this family, Laura. If something's out of place, he's trying to tell us before it's too late." With that, John opened the door gently, the old hinges releasing a quiet groan that seemed oddly louder against the thick silence of the early morning hour. The hallway stretched before him like a narrow tunnel, its long shadows cast by the dim nightlight flickering from the corner, swaying faintly with the draft that passed through the house. Each step he took felt deliberate, like wading deeper into waters he couldn't yet see the bottom of, his mind flickering between logic and an unspoken dread. The soft tapping of his slippers against the wooden floor was joined by another sound now, the unmistakable pacing of Rex on the other side of the nursery door. John's heart picked up pace, not because of fear exactly, but because of that quiet voice inside every parent that awakens when their child might be in harm's way. Behind him, Laura followed closely, her own steps lighter but no less anxious, her breath hitching slightly as she whispered into the narrow corridor, "Do you think Nicholas is all right?" John didn't answer immediately, instead reaching out to grasp the nursery door handle, his fingers tightening as he felt the cool metal beneath his palm. "We'll find out in a moment, honey. But whatever happens, stay calm and trust Rex," John finally said, his voice barely above a breath. With a slow, careful pull, the door opened inward, revealing a sight that struck them both like a sudden gust of winter air cutting through warm skin. The soft glow of the nightlight illuminated the nursery, where Rex stood motionless beside the crib, his head lowered, his eyes locked firmly on the swaddled child. But it was not the sight of the dog standing guard that made Laura gasp, it was the fact that Nicholas's crib stood empty, the blankets pulled outward. There, resting on the thick nursery rug just feet away from the crib, was Nicholas himself, tightly bundled and cradled inside the very blanket that once covered him. Rex had carefully dragged the infant out of the crib, positioning him on the floor as though protecting him from something unseen inside that wooden frame. John froze, his breath caught halfway in his throat, as his mind struggled to grasp what could have compelled the normally obedient dog to take such extraordinary action. Laura knelt instantly beside her son, gently touching his cheeks, her hands trembling as she whispered his name and felt the steady warmth of his breath against her fingers. "He's okay, John. He's okay," she sobbed softly, overwhelmed with relief but equally shaken by the mystery unfolding before their eyes. John crouched beside her, running his hand across Nicholas's forehead, confirming what his wife had already discovered, though his eyes never once left the shepherd's unwavering stare. "Rex," John finally spoke, his voice deep and steady. "Why would you pull him out of the crib like that? What's going on, boy?" At the sound of his name, Rex's ears perked slightly, and then, unexpectedly, his nose lifted toward the ceiling, nostrils flaring once more as if catching some elusive, drifting scent. John followed the direction of Rex's gaze instinctively, narrowing his eyes as he too began to notice something unfamiliar in the room's still, heavy air. "What is it, John? What's happening?" Laura asked, sensing the tension growing thick around them like a storm gathering just over the horizon. John's voice broke through the quiet like the low rumble of distant thunder, calm but carrying an unmistakable weight that could not be ignored. Laura, there's something in the air, something I can't quite explain yet, but I can feel it, and so can Rex. He rose slowly to his feet, his eyes narrowing as they scanned the softly lit nursery, every corner and shadow suddenly holding more meaning than they had before. The air was heavier now, not thick like smoke, but dense in a way that clung to the skin and whispered of something unnatural. It wasn't the kind of stillness that comforted a man at night, but rather the kind that made his instincts stir and his pulse quicken. Laura, still kneeling beside baby Nicholas, clutched the child tighter, drawing him closer to her chest as her voice trembled softly under the weight of John's words. But John, the house feels the same. There's no fire, no noise, nothing out there that I can hear or see. John took a slow step forward, his hand lightly brushing across the wooden edge of the crib, feeling its cold, smooth surface beneath his calloused fingers. That's exactly what bothers me, Laura. It's not what we see. It's what we don't see, and what Rex sees. Rex remained by the far corner of the room, his gaze now shifting back and forth, his body rigid like a soldier awaiting further orders. The dog's ears twitched, following something invisible to their human eyes, as his nostrils flared once again with sharp, focused breaths. John watched him carefully, feeling the hairs along the back of his own neck rise in silent agreement with the shepherd's growing unease. Rex never moves Nicholas without a reason, Laura. Something drove him to act. Something told him that crib wasn't safe tonight. Outside, a sudden gust of wind scraped the bare branches against the house, the sound scratching like old fingers on frosted window panes. Laura's voice cracked slightly as her eyes darted across the room, trying to force reason where none would willingly appear. Do you think it's something in the house? Could it be a gas leak? Or maybe some electrical fault we can't see? She asked, her words trembling on the edge of fear. John exhaled deeply, rubbing the back of his neck as he glanced toward the hallway, feeling that instinctive pull to investigate further despite the weight pressing against his chest. I thought of that, Laura. But the monitors are steady. No alarms. No smoke. And the power's still running clean. He paused for a moment, his eyes returning to Rex, whose head suddenly tilted toward the ceiling, his body stiffening as though a silent alarm had sounded only for him. There's something else here. Something Rex is trying to shield Nicholas from. And whatever it is, it hasn't shown itself yet. The words hung between them, like heavy clouds threatening to break open, while the quiet hum of the house offered no comfort in return. For a brief moment, Laura's mind traveled to memories of her grandmother's old stories, tales whispered late at night about things that walk in the unseen hours. John, you don't think this is something not of this world, do you? She finally asked, her voice barely more than a breath, filled with that strange mixture of fear and wonder passed down from old country folklore. John held her gaze for a long, silent moment, his face set firm as he weighed what logic dared not explain, but instinct could not dismiss. I don't know yet, Laura. But I know this. Rex has never failed us, and his instincts are older than science. As if to punctuate John's words, Rex suddenly emitted a sharp, urgent bark, not loud enough to startle Nicholas, but sharp enough to signal something had shifted. A draft swept across the nursery floor then, colder than it had any right to be, swirling the edge of Nicholas's blanket like invisible fingers passing through the fabric. John felt it roll past his ankles like the breath of something ancient and unseen, carrying with it a faint, unfamiliar scent that made his stomach tighten. Laura's eyes widened as she pulled Nicholas even closer, her voice breaking once more under the mounting pressure of unanswered questions. John, what if it's coming from inside the house? What if we're not alone tonight? John's voice dropped into a tone reserved for moments when a man speaks softly, not out of fear, but out of respect for something larger than himself. Laura, if we're not alone tonight, then whatever's here isn't making itself known in any way that makes sense to us yet. The words seemed to settle in the air between them like slow-moving smoke, swirling with the weight of old fears long buried but never quite forgotten. Laura held Nicholas tighter, her fingers gently stroking the back of his tiny head as if the simple rhythm might somehow shield him from unseen harm. John stepped forward once more, his gaze now carefully studying the corners of the nursery, where moonlight and shadow danced together like quiet conspirators in the night. The familiar rocking chair creaked slightly in the corner, swaying without touch, though no breeze moved visibly through the room, a detail John noted without speaking aloud. He inhaled deeply, pulling the scent of the room through his nose like a man testing the wind before a distant storm arrives. And there it was again, faint, strange, unfamiliar, a sharp, almost metallic edge beneath the normal smells of the house. The soap, the laundry, the lingering warmth of bedtime. Rex's low growl hummed softly beneath John's breath, not aggressive but vigilant, as if warning something unseen that he stood ready to protect what was his. John's mind began to sift through every possibility, from gas leaks to faulty wiring, but none fit the strange way the air seemed to feel wrong rather than simply smell wrong. The dog's sudden alertness, Nicholas being pulled from the crib, and now this unshakable sense of presence, all pointed towards something methodical, not random. "Laura, I want you to take Nicholas into our room and close the door," John said, steady but firm, his eyes never leaving Rex's posture. Laura's lips quivered as she looked up at him, torn between trust in her husband and the primal need to stay near the one who would face danger. "But John, if something's here, shouldn't we stay together?" she asked, her voice heavy with worry, her hands instinctively tightening around the baby once more. John took one careful step closer to her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder, speaking with the quiet authority of a man who knew fear but would not yield to it. "If this is something I can handle, I need to know you and Nicholas are safe behind that door while I do." The grandfather clock down the hall struck a single, hollow chime as the time slid closer to 3:15 a.m., its deep note rolling through the walls like an echo from another world. The old house, built strong but aged by decades of seasons and storms, seemed to breathe with them, its old bones creaking softly in the strained silence. Laura finally nodded, rising to her feet with Nicholas still bundled close, her eyes wide as she glanced one last time toward the shifting shadows in the nursery. Rex followed her movement for a brief moment, his ears flicking backward as if torn between guarding the child and remaining beside John. "Stay with him, Rex," John whispered, his voice carrying an unspoken gratitude for the dog's silent courage and ancient loyalty. With that, Laura moved carefully into the hallway, her footsteps light but hurried, disappearing toward the bedroom as the door closed with a soft click behind her. Now alone in the nursery except for Rex, John allowed his breath to steady, his senses widening like an old hunter listening to the quiet between the trees. A faint scratching sound came from within the walls, low and irregular, as if something brushed lightly against the beams hidden behind the drywall. John's brow furrowed deeply, his mind racing with new questions. Was it vermin, or something more deliberate and calculating, something with intention? The air grew colder again, not from any draft he could detect, but from that unnatural drop in temperature that seemed to seep straight through the skin into the bones. His voice broke the quiet once more, speaking not to Rex, nor to the empty room, but perhaps to the thing that might be listening even now. "If you're here, show yourself. I don't scare easy, but I won't let you harm my family." And then, as if in response to his words, a soft, rhythmic tapping echoed from beneath the floorboards, slow, deliberate, almost intelligent. John's chest tightened as his heart pounded a slow drumbeat against his ribs, the gravity of the moment settling in like heavy fog on a southern morning. Rex's growl deepened as his body turned toward the floor itself, his paws shifting slightly, muscles tense, eyes fixed on a point beneath the nursery rug. John knelt carefully beside him, his fingers running across the old floorboards as the tapping continued, patient, steady, as though it had waited for them all along. He glanced once at the clock's unmoving hands and then whispered the question that carried all the weight of a father's rising dread. "Rex, what in God's name is under my house?" Rex, though incapable of words, answered in the only language he had ever known, one forged by instincts older than man himself. With a sudden jolt of movement, the old shepherd lowered his chest to the floor, pressing his powerful snout firmly against the worn wooden boards beneath him. His muscles trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a primal tension, the kind an animal carries when danger lies just out of reach. John watched as Rex's nostrils flared again, pulling in long, deliberate breaths, as though he were reading an invisible story written in the very air itself. The tapping beneath the floorboards paused, almost as if it, too, recognized that it had now become the hunted rather than the hunter. John leaned in closer, his ear inches above the cold planks, straining to hear whatever had triggered this standoff between his dog and the unseen force below. And then it came again, faint, deliberate, like the careful tapping of bone against wood, repeating a pattern that felt disturbingly intentional. Outside, the wind had quieted, leaving the house suspended in a hush so deep that even the creaks of old timber carried like distant voices. John's breath slowed as his mind struggled to anchor itself between logic and an unsettling truth that logic could no longer contain. "Laura, I believe the answer's right beneath us," he whispered aloud, his voice heavy with the weight of a father's growing dread and a man's desperate need to understand. The floor suddenly vibrated beneath his hand, not violently, but with a subtle rhythm, as though something shifted or repositioned itself just below the nursery. Rex's ears shot upward again, and a deep, guttural growl escaped his throat, not the bark of warning, but the growl of confrontation. John steadied himself, forcing his breathing into slow, measured draws as he traced the edges of the rug with his fingertips, searching for any hidden imperfection. His hand came to rest on a small, almost invisible knot in the wood, one that felt slightly warmer than the surrounding floorboards. Rex shifted beside him, his heavy frame hovering protectively as though bracing for something that neither man nor dog fully understood. In the distance, the old pipes in the house moaned gently, the sound eerily reminiscent of sighs from a long-forgotten graveyard on a cold night. John's fingers pressed into the knot again, and to his surprise, it shifted ever so slightly, revealing a tiny seam, a hatch concealed beneath layers of time. His pulse quickened as the realization set in. Something or someone had long ago built an access point beneath his family's nursery. He turned his head toward Rex, locking eyes with the dog whose steady gaze seemed to say, "We are not dealing with something natural here." John sat back on his heels, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand as the chill of the room gnawed at his skin. In that moment, the tapping resumed once more, as if mocking their discovery, steady, deliberate, patient, like a distant drumbeat calling them deeper. John whispered aloud, as much to himself as to the faithful creature by his side, "Rex, who would hide something beneath a child's room?" The shepherd didn't respond in words, of course, but his sudden rigid posture spoke volumes. Danger was no longer approaching. It was already here. John's eyes narrowed as his mind traced back through the years, the previous owners, the renovations, the quiet rumors about the house's long-forgotten past. Laura's voice cracked through the doorway just then, barely audible but sharp with anxiety, her question cutting through the building storm inside his mind. "John, should we call someone? The police? The fire department? I don't know what else we can do now." John's voice drifted gently across the narrow hallway, calm and measured, like the way an old oak creaks when a steady breeze passes through its branches. "No, Laura, not yet. If we bring the authorities into this too soon, they'll bring questions we aren't ready to answer." His words weren't born from arrogance or stubbornness, but from a lifetime of understanding that some matters must be faced privately before the world rushes in. Laura, standing behind the closed bedroom door with Nicholas still bundled against her chest, listened to her husband's voice and felt both reassured and unsettled by his determination. In her arms, Nicholas stirred lightly, his tiny fingers curling into the folds of the blanket as if reacting to some quiet current moving through the house. John turned his eyes back toward the hatch beneath him, that small, almost mocking seam in the floor now pulsing like the faint heartbeat of something hidden. Rex remained still at his side, his breathing steady but alert, every muscle tense and ready, as though guarding a line he would not let be crossed. The tapping beneath the floor slowed, each beat growing farther apart, like the measured toll of a distant bell announcing the passing of unseen hours. For a moment, John let his mind drift back to the day they first bought this old house, how the realtor had spoken carefully of charm and history. He remembered the little gaps in the story, the conveniently missing details about previous owners, and how certain questions had been answered with tight, polite smiles. At the time, John had thought nothing of it. After all, older homes carried their secrets like old men carried scars, quietly and without complaint. Now, those old gaps whispered back to him with new meaning, filling the empty spaces with uneasy possibilities that refused to be ignored any longer. He ran his hand slowly along the worn edge of the rug, pulling it back to fully expose the hatch, its outline clearer now beneath the dim light. The coldness that rose from the narrow seam touched his skin like breath from a deep, forgotten cavern where sunlight had never reached. Rex shifted slightly, his low growl vibrating through the floorboards as if warning the very ground beneath them not to move an inch closer. John studied his dog for a long moment, marveling once again at how this creature, without the burden of words, saw truths men often missed. Rex, you felt this longer than any of us. You knew something was here before the first creak woke me from my bed. The shepherd's ears twitched at his name, and his gaze never left the hatch, as though he could see straight through the wood into what waited below. John's fingers curled beneath the small handle concealed at the edge of the hidden panel, its metal surprisingly warm to the touch, as though touched from beneath. For a moment, he hesitated, not from fear, but from the solemn weight of understanding that once opened, some doors can never be fully closed again. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself as Laura's voice cut gently through the thickening silence, asking a question trembling with love and dread alike. John, whatever's down there, are you sure you want to face it alone? Her voice carried all the weight of a wife who had stood beside her husband through life's many storms, trusting him, fearing for him, loving him still. John turned slightly toward the closed door, speaking softly so she would hear, but firmly enough so there would be no misunderstanding his resolve. I won't be alone, Laura. Rex will be with me. And whatever's down there, I owe it to our son to find out. He paused, listening for any movement from beneath, but the tapping had stopped entirely now, replaced by a hollow, waiting silence that almost dared him to proceed. The grandfather clock let out another deep chime, 3:30 a.m., as though marking the hour of decision with a slow, deliberate note of finality. John's hand tightened around the hatch handle, the metal cool beneath his calloused fingers as the weight of the house seemed to lean in closer. And then, as he began to lift the panel, a faint whisper of air escaped from below, dry, cold, and tinged with an earthy dampness that smelled ancient. The wooden hatch groaned softly, like an old voice awakening from decades of sleep, revealing a narrow set of wooden stairs descending into a pocket of darkness. Rex took a cautious step forward, lowering his head toward the opening, his growl softening but never ceasing, as if warning the shadows of his presence. John stared into the black void below, where even the faint light from the nursery seemed unwilling to follow, as though the darkness swallowed it whole. He drew one steady breath, his voice soft but determined, whispering to himself and to Rex as they stood on the edge of the unknown. All right, boy, let's see what secrets this house has been hiding beneath our feet. John's voice hung low in the thick air, steady but cautious, as though he was speaking not only to Rex but to the house itself. All right, boy, let's go slow. Whatever waits down there has already been waiting for a long, long time. The opening beneath them seemed to exhale a breath of cold air, brushing past their faces like a whisper from something buried deep in the earth. John reached for the old lantern mounted on the nearby wall, one of those heavy, cast-iron relics left behind by the previous owner, rarely touched until now. His fingers worked methodically, striking the flint wheel until the wick caught flame, and a dim, flickering light spread across the top of the stairwell. The soft glow revealed narrow wooden steps descending into a tunnel far older than the rest of the house, carved by hands long forgotten by time. Rex stood motionless at the edge, muscles taut, his deep brown eyes scanning the descending shadows, reading signs that only his kind could ever fully comprehend. John inhaled slowly, letting the cool, damp air fill his lungs, carrying with it the sense of old earth, mildew, and something else, faint, metallic, almost medicinal. The stairs creaked beneath his weight as he took the first cautious step downward, the lantern's glow bouncing off the rough walls like nervous fireflies trapped in stone. Rex followed, his body moving with silent grace, each paw landing softly on the wood, his head low, ears twitching at every sound from the hollow space ahead. The deeper they descended, the quieter the world above became, until even the creaks of the old house faded into a distant, forgotten memory. John's mind wrestled with questions that clawed at the edges of his thoughts. Who had built this place, and why had no one spoken of it before? Each step seemed to pull him further away from the comfort of his home, and deeper into something ancient that did not want to be disturbed. The narrow passage finally opened into a small, low chamber, its walls lined with rotting beams that sagged under the heavy weight of time itself. The lantern's glow danced across odd shapes resting along the dirt floor, old wooden crates, rusted metal tools, and remnants of canvas sacks long since surrendered to decay. Rex growled softly as he sniffed the stale air, his body shifting toward the far end of the chamber where a second passage yawned open, darker than the first. John moved carefully, his boots crunching over scattered debris, while his eyes traced faded symbols carved crudely into the stone walls. Symbols that carried no meaning he could recognize. The atmosphere pressed against him like invisible hands, heavy and deliberate, as though the very air sought to turn him back before he saw too much. He paused near an overturned crate, noticing something strange within its broken planks, small, carefully wrapped cloth bundles, each tied with blackened twine like forgotten offerings. Leaning closer, he could see faint stains spreading across the fabric, old but unmistakably organic, making his breath catch somewhere deep in his chest. "Good Lord," John whispered, his voice barely audible, though the weight of his words seemed to press the air even heavier against his chest. Rex's growl deepened once again, his body shifting protectively closer, as if the act of discovery itself had awakened something sleeping within these walls. And then it happened, a sound unlike any they had yet heard, not the tapping from earlier, but a slow, dragging scrape echoing from beyond the second tunnel. John froze, his heart hammering now, not from fear of the unknown alone, but from the realization that the unknown was no longer still. Rex took a half-step forward, his teeth baring slightly, his instincts sharpening into something primal, prepared for a confrontation older than speech. John raised the lantern higher, its fragile light pushing just far enough to reveal the narrow tunnel ahead where the sound had originated moments earlier. The tunnel's floor sloped gently downward, disappearing into an inky void where the air grew colder, and the silence seemed to pulse with life. He whispered, more to himself than to anyone else, his words trembling with awe and growing unease. What in God's name were they doing down here? The distant scraping came again, slower, closer, like something shifting, repositioning itself just beyond the reach of their fragile circle of light. And then, cutting through the heavy silence, Laura's voice called faintly from above, filled with a mixture of panic and helpless love. "John, are you still all right? Should I bring Nicholas out of the house?" John lifted his voice just enough for Laura to hear, his words rising from beneath the floor like a thread of calm through the dark. "No, Laura, not yet. Whatever's been waiting here, it hasn't made its move. I need to know what we're dealing with." His voice, though steady, carried the quiet weight of a man standing between two worlds, one of family and one of something far older. Above him, Laura's worried breath was barely audible, like the trembling voice of a woman praying for dawn to break faster than it ever could. Down here, though, in the damp belly of their home, there was no such comfort of passing time, only the steady drip of moisture from the stones. John pressed further into the narrow chamber, lantern raised high, its flickering flame stretching shadows that seemed to crawl and retreat with every careful step he took. Rex stayed inches ahead, his tail low, his ears swiveling constantly, reading a language written in scent and vibration far beyond human comprehension. As they approached the second tunnel, the air thickened, not with smoke or gas, but with a cold so heavy it felt almost wet against their skin. The dragging sound they had heard moments ago had fallen silent now, as though whatever made it was waiting, listening, measuring their courage. John's breath slowed as he stared into the darkness ahead, his mind revisiting old conversations with neighbors who spoke carefully about this house's long and forgotten past. He remembered the way old Mr. Hastings had once lowered his voice, speaking of strange happenings back when the property belonged to the Warburton family generations earlier. Rumors of disappearances, unexplained noises, and visitors who left quickly in the night had swirled like campfire stories too outlandish for daylight conversation. John had dismissed them then, as a man often does when buying a house. Practical men fear termites, not old wives' tales. But now, standing before this ancient hollow carved beneath his son's nursery, he felt the old whispers gathering again, circling him like silent witnesses. Rex growled once more, lower now, steadier, his head turning sharply toward a faint glimmer that danced along the far wall of the passage. John followed his dog's gaze and caught sight of something small and metallic, half buried in loose soil just beyond the reach of the lantern's circle. Cautiously, he stepped forward, his boots crunching softly over the damp earth as the lantern's glow revealed a rusted metal box, no larger than a shoebox. The lid was sealed with a twisted iron latch, old but remarkably well-preserved, as if someone had taken great care to ensure it would remain closed. He knelt slowly, wiping dirt away with his sleeve, revealing strange markings along the lid, symbols he could not read. carved with care by hands long gone. The box radiated an unnatural chill, its coldness seeping into his fingers even through the worn fabric of his shirt, sending a deep tremor through his spine. John whispered, almost to himself, the words emerging like breath from deep water. "What on earth were you protecting down here?" For a long moment, neither man nor dog moved, the two of them standing at the threshold of knowledge neither of them had truly asked for. Then, as though summoned by the very act of discovery, a deep creaking groan echoed from somewhere further inside the tunnel, not mechanical, but organic. It was the kind of sound that suggested not a thing, but a presence not dead, yet not entirely alive, waiting in silent hunger. Rex shifted his stance again, growling deeply, his head lowering to protect John, his entire frame coiled and ready to strike if the shadows demanded it. John steadied his breath once more, forcing himself to think clearly, even as the chill gnawed at the edges of his nerves like winter winds through an old barn. He reached for the latch of the box, his fingers brushing its cold iron, knowing that the contents inside might hold answers the daylight could not explain. But before his hand could lift the lid, a faint voice, almost like a whisper carried through old stone, curled into his ear from the darkness. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice murmured, not loud, but intimate, like breath against his skin, ancient and strangely sorrowful. John froze, his eyes darting into the void ahead, where no living figure stood, yet where the voice most certainly had come from. The moment held like stretched wire, thin and ready to snap, as Laura's voice called faintly again from above, more desperate this time. "John, please tell me, are you safe?" John's voice rose from the cold mouth of the hidden chamber, steady but laced with a solemn gravity that pulled Laura's breath in. "I'm safe, but not alone. There's something else down here, Laura. It's old. It's been waiting far longer than we've lived here." The words hung there in the space between them, traveling up through wooden beams and plaster like old ghosts climbing for air after years of silence. Above him, Laura gripped Nicholas even tighter, her heart pounding so loud it seemed almost to shake the quiet walls around her. Down below, John kept his lantern high, its frail circle of light flickering as though the flame itself sensed what words could not describe. Rex remained inches away, his growl steady, like a low note played beneath a hymn no one wanted to sing but could not avoid. The metallic box before them still sat in its resting place, its iron latch gleaming faintly beneath the trembling flame, daring John's hand to return. The disembodied voice that had whispered earlier did not speak again, but its presence clung to the air, thick as river fog before sunrise. John's eyes narrowed as he stared deeper into the black throat of the second tunnel, where no wind stirred and yet something seemed to breathe. A new sound echoed faintly now, not the scraping from before, but a rhythmic pulsing, like the slow beat of a giant, hidden heart. The very walls seemed to contract with each beat, groaning softly, as though the earth itself was alive beneath the foundation of their family home. He whispered under his breath, not daring to raise his voice further, "Rex, this place isn't just old, it remembers things it was never meant to hold." The shepherd's ears twitched at John's voice, but his eyes never wavered from the far passage, his instincts locked on a danger no man could fully grasp. The pulsing continued, growing louder but never frantic, like the slow, deliberate counting of something measuring their every move. John's hand hovered once more over the box, knowing instinctively that whatever answers lay hidden inside, they were never meant for casual discovery. His fingers closed firmly around the latch, its iron surprisingly warm, almost as if the box itself possessed a faint, unnatural pulse of life beneath its shell. And then, as though responding to his touch, a gust of cold wind pushed upward from the tunnel, unnatural, deliberate, as if exhaling from long-held breath. The lantern's flame jumped wildly, sending long shadows sprawling like reaching arms across the low, uneven ceiling of the subterranean chamber. John's throat tightened, not from fear of death, but from the weight of responsibility pressing down like 1,000 stones upon his chest. He had seen storms on the open plains, worked factory lines that shook beneath his boots, and faced years that tested a man's very soul, but never this. The latch clicked beneath his fingers, breaking the silence like the distant crack of an old rifle fired once again after decades of stillness. As the lid creaked open, a heavy, sour air escaped, not the rot of decay, but something dry, ancient, like the breath of sealed time. Inside, resting atop old, blackened velvet, lay a collection of thin, bone-white shards, small, delicate, and unmistakably human. Not tools. Not weapons. Tiny fragments of ribs and fingers, carefully wrapped and stored as if by hands who could not bear to discard them. John exhaled slowly, his mind racing back to those old town rumors, not just disappearances, but families who once lived here and were never seen again. He whispered, voice cracking beneath the weight of revelation, "Good Lord, Laura, they were hiding something far worse than I imagined. These aren't relics, these are remains." As if awakened by the opening of the box, a new sound rose from the dark tunnel, a faint, rhythmic scratching, slow and deliberate. It was the sound of something alive, or nearly alive, making its slow approach, as though drawn by the box's long-awaited opening. Rex's growl deepened into a snarl now, his hackles rising fully, his body shifting to place himself squarely between John and the approaching sound. John's pulse pounded hot in his ears as he stared into that black void, where even the light dared not trespass for long. And then came the faintest glimmer, two pale reflections, like small, watchful eyes, blinking deep within the recess of the tunnel. Laura's voice returned from above, brittle and urgent, carrying all the desperate love a mother and wife could bear. "John, please. Tell me, what do you see?" John's voice, carried through the narrow beams and old floorboards, came heavier now, like the final chord of a hymn that has taken far too long to finish. "Laura, I see the truth. And it's far worse, and far older, than anything we ever feared lived beneath this house." The words left his throat like stones breaking the surface of still water, rippling outward into a silence that had waited patiently through generations of forgotten years. Rex stood frozen at his side, muscles locked and unyielding, his dark eyes fixed upon the narrow tunnel where those faint reflections continued to blink and shift. The scratching sound had grown into a steady, crawling rhythm, deliberate as the ticking of that old grandfather clock upstairs, now approaching the top of the hour. John's lantern flickered wildly, its weak flame fighting the encroaching cold air that seeped upward from the blackness like the exhale of something buried alive. The pale glimmers within the tunnel grew closer, revealing not eyes as John had first thought, but two polished surfaces, smooth, rounded, and unnatural. The figure emerging from the darkness was not like any living creature John had ever seen, nor was it entirely dead, either. Its form was thin, almost skeletal, but its limbs moved with slow precision, as though guided by willpower that refused surrender to decay. Pale skin, stretched tight across angular bones, reflected the lantern's glow with an unnatural sheen, while a faint, wet clicking echoed from its partially open mouth. John's breath caught as a deep understanding settled upon him. This thing was not a ghost, nor a creature, nor a demon born of folklore. It was a man, or what remained of a man, shaped by hunger, isolation, and generations of unspeakable ritual conducted in secret beneath this home. His voice trembled as he spoke the revelation aloud, not for Laura this time, but for himself, as though confession might lighten the terrible weight of it all. This house, it wasn't cursed by spirits or haunted by old legends. It was hiding a family secret, one passed by blood and silence. The creature paused, tilting its head slightly, almost curiously, as though hearing words it had not heard spoken in many decades. John could see now, clearly and terribly, that the tiny bones inside the box were not trophies, nor relics, but remnants of newborns. These were children sacrificed by the Warburton family, long before the Bennetts had purchased the house, to sustain something unspeakable living beneath their feet. Rex's growl rose louder, vibrating through the narrow chamber as the thing took one cautious step forward, its bare feet pressing into the damp earth. John's mind reeled with images, the missing infants, the whispered stories from neighbors too frightened to speak openly, the conveniently evasive answers during the sale of the house. The truth had never been supernatural in the sense of restless ghosts or cursed spirits. It had been far worse, human evil preserved and fed in secret. The Warburtons had not died off as the town believed, at least, not all of them. One had been kept alive, down here, through terrible means. John stepped backward slowly, his voice rising again toward the floor above, where Laura still clutched Nicholas close to her chest. "Laura, listen to me carefully. The danger was never in the house itself. It was always beneath it, sustained for years." Laura's sob caught in her throat, her voice barely more than a whisper as she fought to understand. "But John, how could something like this exist without anyone knowing?" John's answer came steady, though his hands trembled beneath the weight of it, while Rex stood ready to defend until his final breath. "Because, Laura, monsters do not always come from ghosts or shadows. Sometimes, they're born from men desperate to keep bloodlines alive at any cost." As John spoke, the creature halted, its head tilting again, responding as though hearing the truth spoken aloud triggered some old, buried memory. In that brief pause, John seized the only chance they had, pulling Rex quickly as he stepped backward toward the wooden stairs that led back to the nursery. The momentary retreat was aided by the thing's hesitation, as if the air itself held it momentarily suspended in its ancient purpose. The lantern flickered one final time as John reached the base of the stairs, casting the last image of that pale, hollowed face before darkness swallowed it again. With Rex at his heels, John climbed swiftly back toward the hatch, slamming the wooden panel closed behind him, sealing the darkness once more beneath their feet. Laura stood trembling near the crib, Nicholas still asleep in her arms, unaware of the horror narrowly avoided. John embraced them both, his breath heavy but steady now, whispering softly against Laura's ear. "It's done, Laura. We know now. And we will never sleep in this house again." Outside, dawn's first light finally touched the old home, bleeding through the windows like hope returning after a long, brutal night. In time, the authorities would arrive, and the truth would be brought into the daylight where secrets rot fastest. But for now, John, Laura, Nicholas, and Rex stood together in that fragile peace, survivors not of ghosts, but of the darkest thing man can ever face. The evil men commit, and then bury, hoping time will forget. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you tuning in from? It's always a joy to see how far these stories reach. And if this one touched your heart, go ahead and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Until next time, take care.